Back in 2015, I decided to buy a Nintendo 64 with a copy of Super Mario 64 alongside it. I just wanted to try an old game on original hardware instead of an emulator on PC, just to see what that experience would be like. Almost immediately though, I was hooked and became more and more interested in older consoles and their games. Thus, I started game collecting. I've seen a lot of game collecting videos over the years, and in those videos people usually tell a bit about their journey and how they got some of their games in their collection. But more often than not, they're from somebody who lives and collects in America. Which is cool of course, but I rarely see any European game collectors out there sharing their collections and telling their stories. And I think that's kind of a shame because the European game market is so radically different from the American one. Pricing and rarity, the games that did and didn't release here, the box art, the title of games, even entire games are sometimes completely different to what they're like in America. So today, I just want to look at the world of European game collecting. We'll go over all the big, the small, and frankly, bizarre changes sometimes that European games have over here compared to America. The general consensus for game collecting in Europe, from what I've seen and heard over the years, is this. It's cheaper, but it's also not as good. Cheaper is true for like 90% of the time. Just go to price charting and type in the name of any game. Most of the time the value of the European version of the game is lower than the American version, sometimes even by significant amounts. Take for example Sonic the Hedgehog on the Master System. In America, this is an extremely rare game that goes for hundreds of dollars. I think I got my copy for like €5 in a game store. So yeah, usually it is cheaper than American game collecting. But why do people think it's not as good? Well, there are a couple of reasons I can think of. The biggest one is that the games in Europe used to play 12.5% slower than in America. This is not a joke, this is something to do with how electricity through Europe is distributed, which is a long and complicated explanation, but the basics is this. Games in America run at 60 Hz, and games in Europe run at 50 Hz. This isn't the case anymore, by the way. This got changed around the GameCube, Xbox and PS2 era, but before that, companies didn't consider the Hertz problem when porting games over to this territory, so games ran slower. This is an example I always see people use, but you can really tell with the Sonic games. I usually don't mind this. Most of the time I don't even notice it or I'm able to ignore it. Very rarely does it ever get in the way of my experience playing games. Sonic is one of those examples where I felt the game was severely impacted because of the speed difference, since that game is mostly about going fast. And again, this isn't the case anymore. Games play at the same speed as in America and have done so for around 20 years now. Back in the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s, the European game market was considered kind of risky and low priority for game companies. Thus, it was always the last to receive a game. Usually Japan would get a game first, then a few months later, America would get it, and then a few months after that, Europe would finally get it. Usually around a year or so after the game originally came out in Japan. But that also meant if a game didn't sell very well in America, they just didn't bother releasing it in Europe. Earthbound, one of the most well-loved and acclaimed games of all time, didn't sell well initially. Let's not bring it out in Europe then. Ooh, those Parasite Eve sales aren't really impressing us. Let's cancel the European release. But let's still release the sequel in Europe for some reason. I don't know why they did that. Okage? Katamari Damacy? Xenogears? Echo Knight? No, that's too risky. Chrono Trigger or the Final Fantasy games before 7? No, let's instead make an exclusive game for the European market that is very, very simple and basic so the Europeans can get used to the idea of playing an RPG, so that we can eventually release more RPG games later? What? But selling badly isn't the only reason why games didn't come to Europe. Sometimes games came out so late for a console generation that companies wanted to focus on making new games instead of focusing on old consoles for European releases. This is why games like Super Mario RPG, Kirby's Anniversary Collection, Hey You Pikachu, all these games didn't release in Europe because they came out so late in their console generation. So does that mean game collecting is terrible in Europe because a lot of great games never released here? Of course not. 90% of all games still released over here. And we even got some games of our own that America never got. Sometimes a game is a little more weird or artsy and might not be the best fit for the American game market. In those cases, companies sometimes prefer to release a game in Europe instead of America, meaning we got some weird games to our name. For example, Toshin the Giant on GameCube, a game where you play as a giant god on an island and you can choose whether you want to be an evil god and destroy the world, or help the inhabitants build their society and terraform the island to their wishes. Tingle Rosy Rupee Land, an adventure game where you go through a land and acquire different items by haggling over a price with people. Kuru Kuru Kururin, a game where you pilot a horizontal ship that constantly spins around and you have to guide it to the end of the level. And hey, we might have missed out on most RPGs, but we did get one incredible RPG that America never got, Terra Nigma. We didn't only get weird game releases though, sometimes seemingly random releases came to Europe, but not America. Trace Memory got a European exclusive sequel on the Wii called Another Code R. Same with Hotel Dusk Room 215 by the same developers, which got a DS sequel called Last Window. Anyone remember Endless Ocean on the Wii? Well, that series started on the PS2 as Everblue, only in Europe. The PS1 also has some really cool exclusives too, like VIP Ribbon, a rhythm game that took up so little space on the PlayStation that you can actually take the disc out of the console whilst playing it and replace it with any music CD. The game would then generate levels based on the CD you would put in, which is honestly incredibly cool and ahead of its time. The PS1 also got Klonoa Volleyball, if you're into that. And you know those two terrible Zelda games on the CDI that weren't made by Nintendo? Well, Europe actually got an exclusive third game called Zelda's Adventure. It's even worse, but that's beside the point. We even got an exclusive physical release in the Wii series of all things, Wii Chess. I don't really know why Nintendo thought only Europeans would be into a chess game on the Wii, but whatever. And there are actually quite some examples of games releasing digital only in America, with Europe getting physical releases. Fatal Frame Maiden of Black Water on Wii U, Siren Blood Curse on the PS3, Brain Training on Switch, and some Xbox Live arcade games got physical releases over here. So we did have some cool stuff released in Europe, even though we missed out on a handful of big games. And with how European games look, you can usually spot these games from a mile away. European boxes and box arts are surprisingly different from their American counterparts. A good thing to begin with is to mention the sizes of the boxes in Europe. The DS, Dreamcast and PlayStation 1 all had bigger cases in Europe, and they had a good reason for this. See, the North American region only has two major languages, English and Spanish. You could make an argument that French is a third major language, but that is only really the case in some parts of Canada. Europe, on the other hand, has a ton of countries who all speak different languages. Now, that isn't too much of a problem for the games themselves. Usually the games are in English with the occasional German or French translation option or dub. But translating every game to every single language spoken in Europe is a humongous task, especially back in the 90s and 2000s when gaming wasn't as fully embraced into the mainstream as it is today. But what is a lot more doable is translating the manual. This way most people can still play and understand these games because they can use the manual as some sort of translation guide for the game. I feel because of this, it's more common to find manuals with used games in Europe compared to America, because people actually used these a lot and kept them close to the game because of it. A thicker manual means thicker case to fit the manual in, hence why some European cases are thicker than American ones. Besides the size of the cases being different, there were a lot of other design elements that were changed in European boxes. Over the years, I've noticed that European game spines are a lot more generic than American ones. They often don't use the game logo on the spine and instead use a generic font on a plain white background. Take for example the PS2. In America, these boxes all have unique spines, but over here, all of them are these same black on white standard font spines. weirdly enough, this isn't consistent. The DS and Wii mostly also have these generic font plain white background spines, but for some games they have the custom logo spines for whatever reason. And for the Xbox 360 it's the complete opposite. The majority of the library has a custom spine on it, but there are still some that use the generic font on a plain white background template. Even the games in the same series aren't consistent with this, so I really have no idea why this was done. And sometimes the entire box was just different. The Dreamcast has this weird double-sided case for every single game, even when the game only had one disc. Sega Saturn games were made of flimsy cardboard over here, and the entire branding on them was just completely different, which is strange. To be fair, everything about the Sega Saturn was strange.
What else can go wrong?
Urgent Synapse on line 2. It's the sphincter.
What is going on up there?
Sega Saturn.
SNES cartridges are completely different looking. They feel a lot more flimsier and lighter than the American game cartridges, and they don't have any labels on them. Not gonna lie, I vastly prefer the American cartridge designs and wish we had gotten them over here. Now these are just packaging details. Most people won't even care about this, and some people might not even notice it. But even the biggest part of the packaging was often changed in Europe. The box art. A huge amount of games have completely different box art in Europe, many of which I kinda prefer honestly. I feel like American box art is so often more generic looking than European ones. And that doesn't mean it's always a bad thing. Sometimes this may actually be preferable. While I like how minimalist the box art for Resident Evil 4 is over here, it doesn't fit this game at all. But for stuff like Eco, this painting-like box art makes a lot more sense than this bad-looking CGI render of the characters. Some highlights of European box art changes that I personally feel look a lot better include Mega Man 1, Heavy Rain, Metal Gear Solid 4, the PlayStation Final Fantasy games, Fatal Frame, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D, Pikmin 2, Silent Hill Origins, Time Splitters 2, and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. It's not like every single box art looks better though. I feel like America has a way better box art for games like the first Ace Attorney, and also Sonic 3, which in Europe looks
That's no good.
But generally, I like European box arts better whenever they were changed. And you know what, the weirdest thing is, you'd think changing the boxes would be something they only did back in the day when the world was a bit more disconnected from each other. When game releases were months apart in regions, instead of coming out the same day everywhere. These changes though are happening to this very day. The Switch is a great example of this. The spines use a completely different font in Europe and are centered instead of being aligned to the top of the box. And we even still have different box art. Breath of the Wild, one of the biggest game releases of the last few years, has a different box art in Europe. It's getting a little more rare nowadays, but they are still changing some games to have different box arts. Changing the entire box and box art just wasn't enough apparently. They had to change some titles too. Castlevania Bloodlines? Nope. Over here that was called Castlevania The New Generation. Kirby's Return to Dreamland? Nah, that was called Kirby's Adventure. Wii. Star Fox. Do you mean Star Wing? Or do you mean Lylat Wars on the N64? Ripto's Rage. Now that sounds a little aggressive. We're gonna have to change that to Gateway to Glimmer. Fatal Frame, that's a bad title for a game about capturing ghosts by taking pictures of them. A way better name for that game would be Project Zero. Seriously, why is this still called Project Zero over here? Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon is just called Luigi's Mansion 2, Rhythm Heaven is Rhythm Paradise, Kirby and the Rainbow Curse is Kirby and the Rainbow Paintbrush, and Quest 64 is called Holy Magic Century. Yeah, that's a way catchier title, cool. So the titles may be different, the box art might be different, but whatever. At the end of the day, these are all the same games. Not only are the boxes different, not only are the titles different, but sometimes there are changes to the games themselves. Take a look at Splatoon 1. This is an incredibly stylish and personality-driven game, which is why I'm completely puzzled to why they took some of that personality out in the European release. A lot of the dialogue is a lot more simple and generic, and iconic phrases like Booyah have been changed to a simple nice, which is incredibly lame to me. Gex. Gex has an iconic voice, for better or worse. It's kinda annoying honestly, but I feel like his expressive snarky voice fits the character really well. So why did Europe change his voice to that of an old British man?
Here's Gexy. A slip of the tongue. It's tail time.
I think they kinda knew this was a bad choice because when it came to Gex 3, they changed his voice again. But not back to the original one.
Just dial me in.
If you're calling from a touch-tone phone, please press 1 now.
Spyro 2 and 3 have music tracks removed and all the tracks are in mono instead of stereo. I'm guessing they might have done this to make space on the disc for the different dubs, but don't quote me on that.
Drachenufer? Ja, da war ich nicht mehr, seit wir Nasty York verhauen haben.
But at the point where we're changing aspects of these games, why not go a little further and just make it a completely different game? Contra is one of the most famous NES games. It's an ahead of its time run-and-gun game with fantastic music and great sprite work. Contra was changed to Probotector over here and all the human sprites were changed to robots. And the games were generally made easier. This actually went on for a really long time. Super C, Contra 3 and Hardcore were all changed to Probotector. And this is at the point where I'm kinda starting to squint my eyes and say, is this even the same game anymore? Thankfully this wasn't done regularly. There are only a handful of examples of this happening, but it's just bizarre that this happened in the first place. So we now know that European games sometimes play slower, but are generally cheaper. They sometimes have different box arts or different titles, and in very rare cases are completely different. But what is it like actually looking for and finding these games in Europe? I live in the Netherlands and have been game collecting here for 8 years now, so I can share some of the experiences I've had with collecting some of these games and how I go about it. Something that I've always been a little jealous of is how common garage sales are in America. Whenever I visit the game collecting subreddit or look at a Discord for game collectors that I'm in, I often see people share their garage sale hauls with games they got for incredibly cheap. Garage sales aren't really a thing in the Netherlands, pretty much no one does them. But we do have something to make up for that. Every year on April 27th, the Netherlands celebrates King's Day. And on King's Day, it is tradition for everyone to set up a little flea market / garage sale, either in the town center or outside of their houses. The entire country basically turns into one huge garage sale. And because it's a holiday event, people usually sell everything they have off for really cheap, since it's more about the festivity than the actual profits. I've gotten some insane deals on King's Day. Games are usually around 1 to 2 euros, and if you're really lucky, you might find some for 50 cents. Part of me thinks King's Day is the reason we don't have a lot of garage sales. Many families likely save up their stuff they want to sell specifically for King's Day. And if they don't, they will likely sell it on Marktplaats. This is basically the Craigslist / eBay of the Netherlands, and there are around 3,000 game ads placed on there every day. But the problem is that people really seem to know their stuff on here and price games accordingly. Or they think they know their stuff and ask way too much for it. But if you know where to look and you're persistent, you can find some amazing deals on here. And of course we also have game stores in Europe, but in the Netherlands at least, a really big one is missing. GameStop is one of the most iconic game stores in America. Not gonna lie, I kinda love GameStop. Whenever I got a chance to visit one in America, they always seem to have a great selection of used games for pretty great prices. But GameStop isn't a thing in the Netherlands. Instead, we have Game Mania. This is the same general idea as GameStop, but not as good in my opinion. Their used game prices can be pretty ridiculous, with most used Switch games still being 55 euros literal years after they came out. There's also a lot more focus on merchandise in my opinion. Tons of statues, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon cards, board games, plushies, stuff like that. I wish game stores here sold more imports from Asia and America, since that would give me a chance to play some of these games that never released here. Some game consoles are region free, so I can actually play American games on it, even though I'm playing on European consoles. I do see imports sometimes, mostly American DS games. The DS era was around the time that the internet really started to become accessible for worldwide online shopping, so importing them became a lot easier. And you always have the option to go to like a flea market or thrift shop, which are basically the same thing as in America, with the same amount of success finding games there. And I want to give a quick shout out to game conventions. They aren't done very regularly in the Netherlands, but when they do, I try to make an effort to go there because they have a lot of great games at really honest prices, and they're probably the best place to find imports. So yeah, in the end, I really like European game collecting. Sure, some things aren't as good as in America, but I don't have to pay $600 to play Sonic on the Master System. So don't feel too bad about it if you're game collecting in Europe. Every region has its own pros and cons, and at the end of the day, game collecting is just fun. Thank you for sticking around to this point in the video. I really want to make more of these videos because I really like making them. So yeah, I hope to see you next time. So a side note, while I was filming this part with the Dreamcast case for Sonic Adventure, I noticed that there was this advertisement in it for, you know, Dreamcast games coming out. It's probably around launch. But what I love about this thing... What the fuck is this?